Good evening. Today's lecture is going to be about the conservation of seagrass meadows, and that builds on the, I guess, more depressing side of seagrass meadows that we discussed in the last lecture, where we saw that globally seagrasses are in decline. There's a lot of threats that they face, and there's a lot of instances where we've seen large-scale loss of seagrass. But the thing is that they're plants, and the world's very good at growing plants, and we know a lot about plants. So actually, there are a lot of means of conserving seagrass. There are a lot of means of bringing it back, and it just requires the right actions to be undertaken, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. And to start that discussion, I'm going to focus on explaining a concept referred to as ecosystem resilience. So there's a lot of evidence in the ecological literature that both ecosystems and populations can flip and flop and then lock into different alternative ecological states. So you can see this picture at the top, picture of a productive, really healthy seagrass meadow in northern Queensland in 2005, being assessed by a team out there, and by March 2007 that seagrass had completely disappeared. It almost like flipped into an alternative state, where the state was one of no seagrass and conditions inappropriate to sustain seagrass. Basically, that's because there's been so much mobile sediment moving around the area, resulting from a large flood, bringing sediments down the catchment, but also as a result of some construction work along the coast, altering some kind of movement of sediment. And when we think about the management of seagrass ecosystems, if we can, I guess, understand the factors that cause a system to flip into that state, for that sustained state to remain locked like that, then we can also begin to understand what are the key driving processes that can actually help the recovery of these systems. So back in 1973, a guy called Holling, he tried to sort of think about the sort of theoretical and sort of concepts behind why ecosystems change. And Holling observed that ecosystems can change suddenly. So they go from that kind of a productive seagrass to nothing, and are profoundly influenced by changes external to the ecosystem, and they're continually confronted by the unexpected. And what he proposes is this concept of ecological resilience and stability that I guess controls these kind of processes of systems changing suddenly, and their ability to respond to those external changes and deal with the unexpected. And he defined ecological resilience as being the amount of disturbance an ecosystem can withstand without changing. And if it is changed, as happens in many systems, it may rebound to its previous state. It can flip to an alternative stable alternative state, but if it's resilient, it can rebound. So he really explained that the resilience of an ecosystem is composed of processes of resistance and recovery. So can a system resist the external change? And if it can't, then it might actually recover. If it can't resist and it can't recover, then it's not a resilient ecosystem. So there's lots of examples around the world where people have studied how ecosystems can be resilient or not, how they can flip to a sort of a contrasting or alternative stable state. And I guess the classic example is the reefs of the Caribbean that once were highly complex habitats composed of high levels of coral cover, full of productive, abundant fish life, and they became overexploited, and they once confronted with the unexpected of large hurricanes, they flipped into an alternative state, and actually they were then unable to recover. Overfishing of kelp forests, leaving an abundance of urchins that then graze on the kelp and ultimately overgraze it, and that results in a loss of those kelp forests, and that's how the system becomes flipped into another contrasting state, and it can be seen to be not resilient to those changes. Another example comes from the Black Sea, where productive fisheries became overfished, and the system, together with excess nutrients, became dominated by species of jellyfish. Here you go, there's the examples of the algal covered reef in the Caribbean, the urchin dominated rocky environment that used to be a kelp forest, and the pelagic system of the Black Sea that used to contain an abundance of fish and is now dominated by jellyfish. So if we think about change in an ecosystem, change is not always bad, you know. In many systems it's part of the natural fluctuation in that system. And the change that exists in different ecosystems can be defined in three different ways. And first of all, you get monotonic change. So if you think of these axes here, on the left we've got the ecosystem state, and I guess from a seagrass perspective you could refer to that as the amount of the percent cover of the seagrass, and the conditions could be the amount of nutrients in the water. And if monotonic change was happening, basically as you increase the amount of nutrients in the water column, there's almost a linear response, a linear decline in that seagrass as you increase the nutrient concentration. And critically, in this monotonic change, if you then remove the nutrient and reduce the nutrients, then the system will follow that same linear relationship and actually recover in ecosystem state. So you put in a water treatment works that reduces the amount of nutrients, and the system just recovers in the same way it declined because of excess nutrients in the water column. Then you get something called a threshold response, and that's when the seagrass meadow, again let's use the nutrient example, is subjected to high levels of nutrients, and it declines and it declines and it declines, and it gets to a point where it falls off the cliff. You put too many nutrients in the water column, you've not controlled pollution, and suddenly the seagrass can no longer deal with that impact, and it declines very rapidly. And as conditions are worse, the seagrass almost completely peters out in abundance and density. What's important here is, again, this is about recovery, not just about degradation and loss. So here, if you put effort in, if you again build your sewage treatment works, then as you reduce the water column concentration of nutrients, then actually the seagrass will follow that same recovery pattern in reverse as its loss and degradation. So increase the nutrients, seagrass will go off a threshold, reduce the nutrients, and the seagrass will recover from that threshold. But that's not always how it is in nature. It's never just that simple kind of habitat and condition driving it. There's always other factors at play. And this is why we think about something called the threshold with hysteresis, or the catastrophic fold. And this is where, again, you get a sort of a threshold response, whereby if you increase the nutrients, you increase it, and the system declines in cover, and then you get to this point F2. You can see that on the graph, F2. Then at F2, ignore the dotted line for a minute, the system falls off a cliff, yeah, and so it gets to a threshold, and it's suddenly sitting a very low level in terms of its ecosystem state. There's very little seagrass left, and I'll show you a revised version of this figure in a minute that explains it a bit more. But what it's saying here is that if you increase the nutrients to a point that the system falls off a cliff, then actually just bringing the nutrient concentrations down to an acceptable level will not actually result in a straightforward recovery that is the reverse of the processes of loss. What it's saying is that the seagrass won't actually recover until the conditions have got really, really good for it to actually be able to respond to those conditions. So it's not a rapid recovery that is a reverse of the degradation. It's different, and that means that's why it's referred to as hysteresis. Its recovery pattern is different to its degradation loss pattern. So here you can see that same graph enlarged onto a bigger figure, and what's happening here is that the seagrass again is being subjected to high levels of nutrients. Yeah, there's no sewage works, and the seagrass is declining, getting to this point F2. And F2, unfortunately, the seagrass can't deal with that high level of nutrient anymore, and rather than keeping declining, it falls off a cliff, and it goes all the way down to this point here. So suddenly you've got a very low ecosystem state as opposed to the original one up here, and maybe this is like 3% cover of seagrass, and up here maybe you had 90% seagrass. So you lost a lot of habitat there, and if we think about the ecosystem services, the whole system has changed and its value has reduced fundamentally. And if you then think about management interventions, you think, okay, we've screwed up here, guys. Let's go to our politicians, get some funding for some sewage treatment. Let's do something about it. So they spend £100 million building an all singing and dancing sewage treatment works, and they think, oh, our seagrass is now going to recover. So maybe the nutrients here are high, and here they're medium. And what you're doing is bringing those nutrient levels down from that high point to that midpoint. But the seagrass is not recovering. And so you then bring some more money in to improve the sewage treatment even more. You put a second treatment works up the river, and you spend even more money. So you get the conditions to here. That seagrass cover, which was at 3%, is now about 5%. Not really improved very much, is it? And that's because this system is now locked in a different state. And in order to allow that system to recover, you're going to have to put in a lot more energy into that system to achieve the recovery to happen. And that might mean additional management, fishery type actions. It might mean intervention in terms of restoration. Whatever it is, that system is not recovering without further assistance. And so it's not till you build 2 sewage works and you put in a whole catchment management program do you see a real increase in seagrass. And so you get to this point here, and ultimately that's when you get this recovery to here. And just to sort of stylistically represent this as a continuous figure, they join up F1 with F2 in order to represent this kind of this phase shift and this hysteresis in the system that doesn't allow recovery to happen, as the reverse of the loss process. And this kind of concept can be presented in an alternative manner, really, by looking at changing stability landscapes and the concepts of basins of attraction. So imagine that figure that you were looking at on the last page, the last slide, and lay it down on its back on the floor, and this is what you've now got here. So this figure on the bottom is that same figure, but it's just laying down on the floor. And again, you start at this point here, and the ecosystem is very happy. We've got 90% seagrass cover. The conditions, the nutrients are very low. Seagrass is happy. There's no stress in the system. It's growing very well. Percent cover is very high. And at this point, if you throw a perturbation into the system, maybe that's a hurricane then the system is very stable because it's not stressed from high nutrient levels. It's not stressed from very much at all. So if you hit the system and it's damaged, it'll easily recover. And this is where the balls and the basins come in. So at this point, you are looking at this first figure, and imagine this ball is moving up and down this basin, and a big hurricane comes in and blows that ball out of its spot. Maybe it blows the ball up to the right, and it's thrown about a huge amount. But the thing is, that system is really healthy. It's got great conditions, and recovery is possible very, very rapidly. And that's sort of described in terms of this ball, in the fact that if you push that ball to the right, it's going to want to come back to the left and sit in that dip. And that's because it's a resilient system. It wants to recover. It's able to recover. And if you move further along this line, then you're going to find different levels of basins of attraction. And on the second one, if you cause a disturbance, then the seagrass will recover. But if you have a big hurricane that comes through, then the ball moves all the way to the right and gets locked into that little dip. But in that little dip, it's not too prone to staying there. A little nudge, and it'll go back into the left-hand basin. And that means it's if you think about management action, you can cause it to recover. Maybe that's a bit of improved water quality. Maybe it's reducing anchor damage. Whatever it is, that system is no longer, it's not really particularly stressed, and you can easily bring it back. The further you go along this scale of basins of attraction, the more likely the ball is to go towards the right, and that's where the ecosystem state is very low. There's not much seagrass left, and it's going to take you a huge amount of energy to move it to the left. And if you look at the far basin of attraction, you'll see that the system has now got very high levels of nutrients, and with that, the systems have been pushed into a low ecosystem state. So there's not much seagrass there at all, and it's going to take you a lot of effort to push that ball to the left. And every time you push it all the way to the top, it's going to run back down and end up in the right-hand basin. And that's because the system is no longer resilient. It wants to remain in that alternative stable state. And it's not until you are actually willing to bring the conditions hugely back to where they were will the system actually recover. A really good example of one of these resilience relationships comes from lakes in I think it's Canada actually, and these lakes have got lots of aquatic vegetation in them, and a key part of that system is the maintenance of total phosphorus. What you can see here from this figure is that the aquatic vegetation was subject to elevated levels of phosphorus, and as that increased, then the vegetation began to decline. So more phosphorus, less vegetation, and ultimately you get to this sort of threshold point where the aquatic vegetation completely disappears. And like my example with the nutrient treatment, it's not till you bring the concentration of nutrients of total phosphorus back down to a really low level, will you actually get any complete response that allows the vegetation to actually recover. So if you think about this in terms of investment, what it's telling you is that there's a big difference between this point here on the left, where you've got a recovering system, and this point on the right, where you've got a degrading system. And if you're going to now bring that aquatic vegetation back to life, then you're going to need to invest a lot more money to get the conditions back to where they will actually support aquatic vegetation and the recovery of that aquatic vegetation. So when you think about hysteresis and the concept of these Z diagrams that I've been showing, a nice way of thinking about it is to look at a camel and its back. The classic phrase is break the camel's back, and this is kind of hysteresis in a nutshell. When you add the last straw that breaks the camel's back, you reach a threshold. So you keep piling and piling and piling, and that camel is really quite strong, but if you pile too much on it, eventually you'll get to a break point. And when the camel's back breaks, it won't just recover when you take the load off the camel. It will need an intervention to bring that back, and this is what we see in marine systems. I'm talking about the example of a seagrass meadow, and we'll also in a future lecture come to the example of coral reefs, how they may be resilient or not in different scenarios, and what the implications of that are for management. So just a reminder, in a seagrass context, you're going from this kind of productive habitat, the top, high percent cover, where it's seagrass dominated, and you change the environmental conditions, and you get to this sort of seagrass depleted state where you've got anoxic stinky mud. So what controls this hysteresis? What are the key ecological processes that drive these changes? So these changes can be influenced by anthropogenic factors. So the more stresses you are, the more stresses you have, the harder the system is to recover, and this changes spatially, but it's those additional cumulative impacts that can reduce the capacity of the system to be resilient and to recover. But more importantly, there's a whole range of different features of the system. We refer to them as resilience features. So that might be things like it might create a seed bank that allows recovery. It might be hugely abundant, meaning that when you get some level of impact, there's a lot of seagrass around to facilitate the recovery. So the more features you have of that of resilience, the more likely it is to be resilient to disturbance events. And what we find is that the more resilience features a system has, the higher likelihood it is to be able to recover and resist from degradation. And there comes a point where you don't have enough of those features, and when you get an impact, recovery is not actually possible. So what are these things in a seagrass context? So diversity is a very key part of ecosystems on our planet, and that's no different in a seagrass context. We get genetic diversity, we get species diversity, we also get habitat diversity, and then there's other features in that seagrass, such as energy reserves and seed banks, that also play their part and their role. So those features allow, genetic diversity means that maybe a system has greater chances of recovering from an impact because it's got different traits in its genetic makeup that allows for recovery. For a system to be resilient, it needs to have conditions that are appropriate. So if it's got clear water and affable temperature and not too many nutrients, then the seagrass is growing very well. It's storing a lot of complex carbohydrates to be able to deal with down periods. So it's doing really well, and it can deal with some of those impacts. But that's not the whole story, because the biological features of a resilient supporting ecosystem are also really important. So everything from the fact that there's lots of fish larvae and invertebrates, to the presence of herbivores such as the green turtle or dugong, and there's an abundance of carnivores present in that seagrass. All those factors contribute to improving the resilience of the system. So what does this actually mean for management? So in order to manage these seagrass ecosystems to be productive into the future, we need to think about improving the resilience, or enhancing the resilience of these meadows, and that's what we talk about in this practitioner's perspective that I wrote together with my wife, Leanne Cullen-Unsworth, basically providing a series of key points as to different ways to secure a future for seagrass. And these different ways I'm going to go through today, and I encourage you to read that paper as a neat little example of the things that you can really do to solve some of the problems faced by seagrass. So we've talked a lot about nutrients in these lectures, and I guess my examples of the resilience Z diagram were very much focused around nutrients, and that's because they are one of the biggest problems that seagrasses face. So if you want to solve water quality problems, mostly you need to think about the management of the catchments that supply nutrient and poor water quality into the coastal environment. And here's an example of how you might be able to deal with that from eastern Indonesia, a place called the Wakatobi. And here we have an example where lots of research, lots of local knowledge pointed to the problems that seagrasses face. One of the biggest ones was sedimentation and pollution, and also overfishing, coastal development, where we're seen as big problems. And we were working with some conservation NGO out in the Wakatobi, and they felt that solving the overfishing problem was almost in their too hard box initially, and they felt that actually people might get behind the concept of sedimentation problems, and with it begin to recognise the importance of seagrass, and then we might be able to deal with the overfishing. So that's what we did. And the riverine catchments of the Wakatobi, often degraded by poor farming practice, really thin soils, and the lack of sewage treatment, and a lack of understanding as to the value of riparian vegetation, and exacerbated also by the need for people to burn wood for fires and to use in construction. And we went up and down some riverine catchments that weren't huge, but there were still significant places to walk over. And what we found is there were sort of many areas where there's sort of a scorched earth kind of scenario, where all along that riverbank there was no vegetation at all, and all you could see was just bare sediment that each time it rained would end up being washed into the river. And the time I was there, we had some very heavy rainfall. We went to some of these locations and witnessed for ourselves the high sediment load that was going into the catchment. And although that sediment is coming from somewhere, it's being disturbed, the ability to stop that going into the river at any rate is quite simple. It's quite possible. It's about replanting vegetation up and down that riverine catchment. And these guys came up with this phrase, saving the land to save the sea. And that's what they were doing, because they wanted to plant vegetation up and down those catchments. But to do that, they actually created an incentive scheme, and an incentive for local people to want to plant and to want to save their riverine catchments. So together with ourselves, we mapped all these areas. We worked out who were the key owners of these bits of land, and at the same time we developed a tree nursery. And what we were growing wasn't just normal trees that you might plant, but it was very targeted about over high value fruit crops. So things like durian, which is a pretty foul fruit from Southeast Asia, but highly valued, and sells well in markets. We did a lot of planting of papaya, a whole series of different fruit species. And by persuading a landowner to take care of its riverbanks into the future, we would agree to plant trees in its riparian areas, and with it, the farmer would have the rights to the crop that comes from those durian or those papayas or whatever that we were planting. So this tree nursery became very, very, very effective, and it's actually quite low cost to set it up, low cost to run, and over a short space of time we had a lot of seedlings going out. And I think over the 2 years that project was running, we planted something like 5,000 trees up and down the catchments of the island of Caladupa, resulting in improved filtration of land runoff, and ultimately saving the land to save the sea. A benthic habitat like seagrass is not a sort of island on its own. There's a whole load of interactions that happen within that ecosystem that have consequences for all the different species present. So if you overexploit key functional groups, some of the herbivores, some of the key predators, then you actually endanger the ecological stability of that system. And we've seen that particularly on coral reefs with the over exploitation of parrotfish as grazers on those reef systems, and we're beginning to see that in parts of Southeast Asia with an over exploitation of rabbitfish as key grazers of epiphytes on seagrass. So putting it simply, if there are key herbivores in that area or other key functional species, you need to maintain them, and you need to maintain them through targeted fisheries measures. Mostly the idea of fishing being banned from particular species, and they have actually done that in some parts of the tropics. I think Belize, it's illegal to fish a herbivore anywhere in the ocean. To do this, you can create small no-take areas, which is what we've done again in the Wakatobi, or you could do targeted fisheries gear management. And although that's kind of complex, it can often have a more productive outcome, as it sort of allows people to fish in all the places they used to fish, but they just have to tweak some of the ways, the gears that they use. Maybe they increase the mesh size. Maybe they only they agree to only take particular size fish. A rather interesting part of our discussion on the ways to increase the resilience of ecosystems, and particularly seagrass, is to think about the development of science industry partnerships. It's all very well being a campaigner from the outside and trying to make change, but sometimes you need to actually not just oppose things, but work with people to make changes. And there's a nice example of this in a place called Gladstone Harbour in Queensland, where there's two major liquid natural gas projects, but these both have two very different outcomes because of their ability of the commercial partner to work with scientists. The first is a project that was undertaken with little engagement, and environmental scientists provided limited advice to the project, and they got an alarming permit to reclaim a whole area of seagrass. On the left, that picture shows myself out on that meadow doing a seagrass survey. An amazing area for dugong and turtle, and then a couple of years later, a dredge digging out the seagrass in Gladstone and damaging that as potential habitat for dugong and turtle. And the thing about this project is that my line manager at the time, Rob Coles, would always say that no one will care until dugongs started washing up on the beach, and that's actually what happened. Arguably, I don't think it was anything to do with this dredging project, but it coincided with a lot of anger from the NGOs about how the reef was in danger, about the mining industry damaging reefs, damaging water quality, and a number of turtles did wash up on the beaches, probably as a result of a hurricane early in the year. But the popular press doesn't hold prisoners when it wants to. It goes at the jugular, and what's clear is that they blamed the deaths of those dugongs and turtles on the land reclamation in Gladstone Harbour, and it went through the press. There was a huge kind of furore about it, major political fallout about who gave the permits for this project. Not a good environmental management outcome. waiting in the wings was another company conducting an LNG development, and what they quickly realised was that there was a lot of problems going on with the first, and they didn't want to be dragged down with it. And rather than ignoring the environmental scientists, they dragged us all into a meeting very early on, and wanted to know how they could do their project without actually damaging the seagrass. And you know, these are projects that cost hundreds of millions of pounds, and if they're delayed by days or weeks because of permitting problems, then they're costing millions each day to have that delay. So actually spending a few million on environmental management, it's probably actually a shrewd investment. What they did is create a whole multifaceted approach to understanding dredging, looking at everything from light requirements to modelling different ways that you can dredge plume to not damage seagrass. Many seagrass meadows around the world are actually subjected to damage and a loss of their resilience due to unsustainable fishing practices. I guess the example at the top is some images coming from prawn fisheries in Cambodia, where they commonly use very heavy beam trawls. They drag them over seagrass, and that leads to a very high loss of that seagrass. And these sort of problems are abundant all around the world. We've seen scallop trawlers damage seagrass in the UK. We've seen blast fishing damage seagrass in the Turks and Caicos, and bleach fishing damaging seagrass. There's all sorts of ways in which seagrass can be damaged by unsustainable fishing practices, and managing that is key to ensuring the future of seagrasses around the world. And a neat example of the management of this sort of activity comes from the southern Ifka, where towed fishing gear was known to be a problem for the seagrasses in the region, and actually the local Ifka created a bylaw to manage particular fishing techniques.